a man who was born a long time ago in a place pretty far from here, in a culture that's very different than ours. And this man was born, and when he was born, something just wasn't right. When they took him and they cleaned him up, they noticed he had all of his fingers and all of his toes and all of those things that parents wish for, just for their beautiful baby to be here. But as they began to look at him a little closer, they noticed that there was something wrong with one of his hands. His hand was deformed. And as they watched him grow a little bit, they realized that it just wasn't going to work the way that it was supposed to work. He was never going to have the use of that hand. And so the parents knew from that moment on that he would never be what everyone around considered normal. There was going to be something different about him. And remember, this was somewhere far away from here, and it was in a culture very different than ours. And they knew that he would never be accepted, that he would never be looked on the same as all of the other kids and eventually all of the other young men and then all of the other grown men. And so those parents made a decision, and they left him. They just left him with some people, and they went on with their lives. Somebody took this boy in, and he began to grow, and he tried his best to fit in. But like I said, it was a different time, and it was a different culture, and people were cruel. And no matter how much he tried to blend in and how much he tried to do things the way that everybody else did them, he just had to do things differently because he had that one hand that didn't work right. And so he was kind of shunned. It was a different culture. They didn't really understand why he was the way he was, and so they blamed it on a lot of different things. And so he continued to grow. He continued to be the outcast. He continued to not be accepted into groups. And he just made his way the best that he could. Until finally he had to be out on his own. And here was the problem. He had to support himself, but he couldn't work. Now, he could work. He could get by. He had figured out ways to do things to make up for the hand that wasn't working quite right. He had even learned to hold it in certain ways where it took people a while to notice. But they always noticed. Eventually, they always noticed. As he was pushing the plow, somebody would finally notice. Or as he was picking the crops, someone would notice. And because they noticed, they didn't feel like they were getting all the work that they could out of him, and so they would let him go. And he would be rejected again, and he would go on his way. As he got older, he came to the realization that he didn't have any parents. Most marriages in those days were arranged marriages. He had nobody was going to give their daughter to him because they didn't feel like he would be able to provide for her. And so not only was he rejected by everybody that he was around, but he also came to the realization that he was going to be alone. And not only would he be rejected by everybody out there, but he would have nobody to hold close, to talk to talk about these things. He was rejected by society because something just wasn't right. His hand just didn't work. And so he finds himself just going from place to place, basically just, it's not that he wanted to, but he didn't have anything, and he didn't have any way to earn any money to get things, and so he found himself, like most people in that day did, just begging on the street. He found himself just begging for people to just give him some crumbs. He found himself just begging for people just to drop some coins in a cup so that he could be self-sufficient. It was kind of a miserable life. Because in his heart, he knew who he was. He knew what his capabilities were. He knew that he could do anything that anybody else could do. But there was that one hand that just kept him from doing it. It wasn't that he didn't desire to. It wasn't that he didn't want to. It was just that he couldn't. Try as hard as he could, he just couldn't be normal. He couldn't do it the way everybody else did it. So I want you to take the picture of that man. And I want you to imagine that that's the man that we're picking up here in Matthew chapter 12. This is the man that I just described to you. Just imagine that this is him. The Bible doesn't really give us his background, so I just let my imagination run. This is who I picture this guy as. And so put yourself in there. Imagine that guy in this situation. Matthew chapter 12, verse number 9, it says, speaking of Jesus, then Jesus went over to the synagogue, where he noticed a man with a deformed hand. That's our man that we're talking about. Jesus went over to the synagogue where he noticed a man with a deformed hand. And the Pharisees asked Jesus, is it legal to work by healing on the Sabbath day? And they were, of course, hoping that he would say yes, so they could bring charges against him. And Jesus gave an answer. If you had one sheep and it fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you get to work and pull it out? Of course you would. And how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? I want you to key in on that for a minute. We're not going to talk a lot about what Jesus said here. We're going to talk more about what Jesus did. But what he said here had some meaning to those Pharisees that he was talking to. Because they knew what they were supposed to do. They knew the law, they knew the rules, and they knew what their rules said that Jesus was supposed to do. Or they believed they knew what those rules said. And Jesus speaks to them and tells them, if you had the sheep fall in a well and it just happens to be the Sabbath, are you just going to let it die in the well, or are you going to get the sheep out of the well? If you're going to get it out of the well, of course, you're not going to just let it die. Is it wrong to do something good on the Sabbath? And what the Pharisees heard as contradiction, this man with the hand that didn't work, this man suddenly had a glimmer of hope. This man who had been this way all of his life suddenly has this hope. Because there's this man talking about healing him. There's this man not talking about just pushing him aside and sending him on his way. There is this man talking about healing him and making him whole. Jesus, in verse 13, talks to the man. Talks to the man. And he says, reach out your hand. And the man reached out his hand, and it became normal, just like the other one. I want to take a few minutes here and just talk about what Jesus did for this man. What Jesus did here that nobody had ever done for this guy before. The first thing that Jesus did, if you go back and you read in verse number 9, it says he went to the synagogue, and verse 10 says, he noticed a man with a deformed hand. He noticed him. He saw him. And he didn't just see him, he saw his hurt. He saw his need. He saw his deformed hand. Now I want you to think about this. This was a guy in a different society than we live in now. This was a guy who had spent his entire life learning and trying his best to blend in. Trying the best he could to hide that thing that made him different. Trying his best to hide the thing that set him apart from everybody else. Trying to put behind him what he felt that God had so unmercifully dealt him. Trying to hide all of that. But Jesus took notice. Jesus took notice of that man's hand. And he knew that something was wrong. How did he know something was wrong? Because Jesus was God. Jesus knew what that man was created to be. Jesus knew that that man was created for such a time as that. He knew that he was going to be there, and he knew what was going to happen. And Jesus knew that this man was fixing to walk into his destiny. He was fixing to have a hand that was no longer deformed. He was fixing to have a hand that was just like the other one. He was fixing to have what he was meant to have all along. What everybody else in the synagogue took for granted, this man was fixing to have for the first time. A hand. A working hand. Think about that for a minute. Just think about your hands. Think about what you've done with your hands today. If you've ever had an injured hand, maybe in a cast or in a splint, you understand how difficult it is to do things with just one hand gone. This man had lived that way his entire life, and he was fixing to be made whole. Okay, that's a great story, but what's that tell us about us? Well, if you look at the first part of that verse, Jesus noticed him. And he noticed all of him. And he especially noticed the one thing that the man was trying to hide from everybody. His deformity. The thing that made him different. The thing that didn't work right. The thing that wasn't the way that it was supposed to be. And Jesus took notice of that. Why? Why would Jesus take notice of that? It wasn't to make fun of him. It wasn't to ostracize him the way that society had done it. It wasn't to push him aside. But he took notice of his need because he was willing to heal that. He was willing to take care of the problem that this man had. He was willing to touch him and to change him. You can't hide your faults from Christ. We do, though. We try to. The video showed a lot of times we just put forth our good hand. Right? We all do that. We put forth our good hand. The hand that we show everybody here on Sunday morning is our good hand. If I were going to show people my hands, my hand modeling career is over, let me just tell you. Because my hands are pretty ugly. I scraped up my finger this morning playing the guitar on my capo. I pulled skin off right there. It's kind of gross. I have these weird white hairs on my knuckles. That's strange. I bite my nails, and so my cuticles are ugly. I've worked pretty much my whole life, and so I have calluses on my hands. Not just like, oh, that's a little callus. Like, I have huge calluses on my hands. The kind that people pay people to take Dremel tools and rub them off. That's what I have on my hand. My wife may never hold my hand again after all of this. But you can look at my hand, you can look at people's hands, and you can tell a lot of things about a person. You can tell what they've done, you can tell where they've been. You can tell if a person's a mechanic, you know how? They have grease on their hands. And it doesn't matter how much they wash them, it's going to be there. It gets way down in there. You can tell if a person has worked hard. Chad and I used to joke all the time. We could tell people that did flooring for a living, like tile and did ceramic and vinyl, because they all have the same set of calluses that go right here. It's from pushing a scraper. And it hurts and it makes you bleed and you cry. Grown men in kitchens just crying. Oh, this hurts. But you do that over and over, and these blisters, these calluses, you get blisters and they just layer over, and you get these calluses on your hand, and those are kind of the only people that have them in those places, and so you can tell that about them. You can tell a guitar player, and you can tell whether they're left or right-handed, because they have a special set of calluses on this hand if they're a right-handed guitar player like me. Look at the end of Chris's fingers or Gary's fingers. He's got calluses from rubbing on those strings. The things that you do mark up your hands. Your life marks up your hands. And this man's hands were marked. Maybe not so much physically. I'm not talking about just the deformity, but his hands were marked by rejection, by criticism, by being ostracized, by being told that he wasn't good enough, by being told that he would never fit the bill, he would never be the person that he needed to be. And all of this came to a head at the synagogue when Jesus noticed him. And he noticed that he was not everything that he was created to be. When Jesus told the man, reach out your hand, I want you to take those words. I mean, some things you read very literally in the Bible, and I understand that, and some things you can't always hang up on because there's translation issues, but I think this is very direct. He said, reach out your hand. He didn't say reach out your left hand. He didn't say reach out your right hand. He didn't say show me your good hand. He didn't say show me your bad hand. He just said reach out your hand. The man reached out the hand that he had been trying to hide his entire life. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. The hand that the man had tried to hide his entire life was the hand that he reached out. Anybody in here remember the show MASH? Anybody in here? All right, enough people I can talk about it. All right. Everybody remember Radar on MASH? Radar had a deformed hand. Bit of trivia for you there. He rarely used it on the show, but if you watched real closely, every once in a while you could catch a glimpse of his hand, and it just wasn't right. His hand was deformed. And so he would use his good hand. When you would see him handing papers or writing or doing anything, he was always using his good hand. But sometimes you would catch his bad hand on top of the table while he was eating. And you would always catch a glimpse of it, but it was never focused in on. If he was using something, it was his good hand. And this man was the same way. If he went to shake your hand, he wasn't going to try to shake it with the bad hand. If he wanted to hand you a little bit of money that he had collected on the street, he wasn't going to use his deformed hand. He was going to use his good hand. And when Jesus said, reach out your hand, he didn't give him his good hand. Why? Why would he not have given him his good hand? Well, the cat was already out of the bag. Jesus had already noticed. He called him over because of it. So there was really nothing left to hide. And I think the reason that he showed him his good hand, his bad hand, was because there was hope there. Because he had heard this man talk, and he had heard of the things he could do, and he reached out that bad hand just thinking, this guy is going to make me whole. This guy is going to make me new. And when the man let down his defenses, suddenly he was restored. Suddenly he was made new. Suddenly his other hand became just like his good hand. He had two hands, as the video said, doing the same thing. Because Jesus had touched him. I say all of that to say this morning. What's up with your bad hand? Before we can go in and talk specifics in the rest of this series on things that your hand should be doing, let's talk about that bad hand that we all have. Now, if we were going to go literal biblical, the Bible says if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. I don't want to go that drastic here this morning. But the Bible says it's better to cut it off and be in heaven with one hand than be in hell with two. And the problem is most of us have one good hand. That's your hand that brought you here this morning. It's my good hand. I'm going to show everybody my good hand. It's clean. Everything's going well. I can move all my fingers. My life is put together. My relationships are fine. My finances are fine. My car got me here fine. We didn't fight this morning as we were getting ready. Everything is good. Hello, this is my good hand. And the whole time this bad hand, instead of being reached out, welcoming, is clenched. Because in this hand, you're saying, I don't know that I'm going to still be married by the end of the day. In this hand, you say, if that kid splashes water one more time out of that bathtub. In this hand, you say, I can't believe I'm going to have to sit in the same row as those people. I do not like them. And in this hand, you say, hi, how are you this morning? We've all got that bad hand. Maybe it's not that. Maybe it's other stuff. Maybe it's this hand that takes us out to hang out in places we shouldn't be, to do things that we shouldn't do. I'm not going to go into specifics. You know. The same way this man knew his deformity and he knew every part of his hand, you know every part of the bad hand that keeps you from doing the things that God has called you to do. Because God has called you to a two-handed job. He needs two hands doing the same thing. He needs two hands reaching out. He needs two hands praying. He needs two hands serving. He needs two hands worshiping. And you are giving him one. And I, many times, am just giving the one. And I keep this one clenched because I don't want anybody to see what's in it. I don't want you to read my hand. Don't want you to know what I did last night. I don't want you to know where I went. I don't want you to know the terrible things that I said this morning. I don't want you to know any of that stuff. And so I give you my good hand. And I keep this one. And we try to do the same thing with God. Like somehow God doesn't know what's up in this bad hand. Like God doesn't understand what's happening. And we hide it. And we praise and we worship and say, oh God, I love you. You know, you're my anchor. I'm shouting on rooftops. You do all of that with your good hand and you keep this bad one clenched. And you keep things hidden. And the whole time I just picture Jesus saying, show me your hand. And you're doing this. And he's saying, I want the other hand. Show me the other hand. Because when we show him this hand, something miraculous happens. When we have to show him our hand, we have to let loose of all the other stuff. To show you my hand, I have to release everything else. To show you my hand, I have to let go of everything else that I'm holding on to that's not the right thing. Jesus is saying, show me your hand this morning. Show me your hand. Not the hand you always show me, but show me the one that I need to take care of. So I'm going to ask you this morning, what's wrong with your hand? What's wrong with it? We all come in here with things that hold us down and keep us back. What's wrong with your hand? Jesus is saying, if you'll just reach it out to me, I'll make it whole. I'll make it whole. I believe it's the NIV version that says his hand was restored. There's a lot of guys in here that like old cars. They like to fix things up. They restore them. When you restore something, you put it back the way it was supposed to be. And sometimes, even better. That's the kind of restoration that Jesus wants to do on you this morning. He wants to put you back the way you were supposed to be, the way you were born to be. And through circumstances and through things that happen in your life, You've got a deformity. It's just not like it's supposed to be. But He wants to restore you this morning.